The wind carried a bitter tang of dust and dried corn husks across the narrow main street of Red Creek, curling around the hitching posts and rattling the boards of the deserted saloons. From a distance, the town looked empty, as though the sun itself had grown tired and left the place behind. Abram sat on the porch of his modest ranch house, hands wrapped around a chipped tin mug of lukewarm coffee, watching the horizon with the patient stillness of a man used to long stretches of quiet. The earth beneath him was cracked and dry, a patchwork of clay and weeds, but had been his home for decades, and in its stubbornness, he saw a reflection of himself. 200 Comanche warriors don't just show up at your barn by accident. They come for blood, for justice, or for war. Abram's chest tightened at the memory, though it had been years since that first encounter. But let's go back to where it all started. He remembered the day Miriam had come into his life, though she arrived under circumstances he would rather forget. It had been market day, and the air was thick with the mingling scents of sweat, hay, and horseflesh. A group of traders had appeared just outside town, shouting over the creak of wagon wheels. The commotion drew a small crowd of locals curious for news, gossip, or mischief. Abram had stayed back, leaning against a fence, the silence of the fields and the distant mountains more familiar to him than the noise of Red Creek. The traders had a peculiar bundle with them. A girl, heavy-set and visibly exhausted, with a sack pulled over her head, her limbs bound roughly with rope. She made no sound but the occasional tremor, and the traders' voices carried over the clamor of the town, like dry leaves skittering across the dirt. 10 pounds of flour, one of them called, grinning as if making a joke only he understood. Or a girl, another added, and the others laughed, loud and brash, as if cruelty were some sort of coin to trade. Abram felt a hollow tightening in his stomach. He had seen poverty, hunger, and sickness before, but the casual barter of a human life unsettled him deeper than any drought or lost calf ever could. People in town murmured, a few tried to look away, and some shook their heads, unsure if it was better to interfere or let the world grind on in its usual, callous way. Miriam had been reduced to a thing, an object of commerce, yet even beneath the coarse sack and the smudges of dirt and sweat, Abram glimpsed something stubbornly alive. The faint quiver of her fingers, the desperate grip on whatever hope she clung to. He remembered stepping forward before he even realized he had moved. The traders had jeered, but Abram's voice was calm, even, carrying over the market's din. "Take her off your hands. I'll pay more than your flour, and I won't haggle," he said. He hadn't thought through the consequences, hadn't counted the cost, but he couldn't ignore the life staring back at him, pleading silently from beneath that rough sack. The traders hesitated, measuring him against the safety of easy profit, before finally shrugging and passing her into his care. Miriam slumped into his arms, the weight heavier than he expected, yet not burdensome in a way people might assume, only weighted with the exhaustion and fear of someone forced to endure far too much. Back at the ranch, Abram had laid her gently on a bed of straw in the corner of the barn. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and violet, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Miriam's head lolled against the straw, and when he loosened the sack, her wide eyes blinked at him, cautious, fearful, yet strangely luminous in the fading light. Abram studied her face, noting the traces of malnourishment and the faint purples around her eyes, likely bruises hidden beneath layers of grime. The girl had been treated as less than human, yet in her gaze, he saw resilience, something that refused to be extinguished, no matter how many hands had tried. The evening deepened, and Abram found himself busying with small tasks, fetching water from the well, repairing a loose board in the barn, chopping a few logs for the night fire. Miriam watched quietly, her breathing slowing as exhaustion claimed her. Abram could feel the weight of the town's unspoken judgments pressing against him. Neighbors would whisper, gossip would spread, and some might even threaten. Taking her in was not just an act of compassion. It was a choice that placed him outside the comfortable lines of conformity. Night fell fully, and the first stars appeared, cold pinpricks in the vast, dark sky. Abram sat beside the small fire in the barn, his back to the shadows, and Miriam slept uneasily on the straw. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint sounds of the town settling into sleep, of horses stamping in distant corrals, of coyotes calling across the plains. Abram poured himself another cup of coffee, still lukewarm, and let the silence settle between him and the girl. He didn't need to speak. In the quiet, understanding passed in the slight rise and fall of her chest, the tension in her small hands. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and Abram's mind drifted back to marketplace, to the laughter of the traders, to the crude barter that had brought Miriam into his care. The moral weight of that day pressed on him, a reminder that the world often demanded hard choices, the kind that left no one unscarred. He had chosen her, yes, but he also knew that the world would not forgive easily. As the fire flickered low, Abram glanced at Miriam again. Her face was relaxed for the first time in days, the faint lines of fear softening in sleep. The barn smelled of hay and fire smoke, of dust and the faint hint of Miriam's presence, faintly sweet, like hope in a world that had forgotten how to nurture it. Abram knew the coming days would be difficult. There would be questions, challenges, whispers, maybe even threats. But for now, he simply watched her, a silent guardian in the quiet of the western night, aware that the choice he had made could change both their lives forever. Above, the stars wheeled silently across the darkening sky, indifferent and eternal. Below, in the fragile glow of the barn fire, a girl who had been treated as nothing more than trade goods dreamed for the first time in weeks, and a man who had long lived alone felt the stirrings of a responsibility heavier than any burden he had carried before. The wind outside moaned softly through the boards, and Abram, sipping his coffee and staring into the shadows, knew the calm would not last. Something, or someone, was coming, and with it, a reckoning neither of them could yet imagine. The sun had barely begun its climb over the horizon when Abram heard the first distant sounds, the faint scrape of wagon wheels on dirt, the low thrum of hooves on hard-packed earth. The early light cast the barn in sharp relief, illuminating Miriam's small, curled form on the straw. She stirred, eyelids fluttering open, and for a moment their eyes met. There was a fragile trust in hers, an unspoken acknowledgement that she was no longer alone in a world that had treated her cruelly. Abram's hands, calloused and steady, adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, offering warmth without words. He thought about the warnings he'd heard in town, murmurs of "she's trouble," muttered over fences and behind doors, the few neighbors brave enough to speak their concern, telling him to think of his own safety, of the peace of the ranch, of his reputation. Then he looked into those desperate eyes again and made the decision that would change everything. He would not send her back to the traders, to the market's cold, transactional cruelty. Not now, not ever. Miriam had nowhere else to go, no one else to protect her. And if he didn't act, no one would. Breakfast was quiet, the crackle of the fire and the soft rustle of straw beneath Miriam's feet filling the silence. Abram had set out a small tin of porridge, watered down, but nourishing enough to rouse her from the remnants of sleep. She ate cautiously at first, as though the very act of eating might betray some hidden danger. Abram kept his distance, sitting across from her, studying the horizon through the barn door. He had always preferred quiet observation, the measured patience of a man who had learned to read both the land and its people. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper, hoarse from weeks of neglect. Where am I?" she asked, eyes wide and cautious. Abram met her gaze steadily, offering a calm, steady assurance that did not require explanation. "You're safe here," he said simply. "For now." That small phrase, devoid of grand promises or embellishment, seemed to settle her nerves. It was all she needed for the moment, the knowledge that she was under the protection of someone who had chosen her even when the rest of the world had refused. Word spread quickly in Red Creek, as it always did in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. By mid-morning, Abram had visitors. Some came with curiosity, some with concern, and a few with veiled accusations. Mrs. Hensley, a widow who lived 3 farms down, shook her head sharply as she entered the barn. "Abram, I don't know what you're thinking," she said, voice sharp but tinged with worry. "That girl, she doesn't belong here. The traders were right. She's trouble. You're asking for nothing but trouble, letting her stay." Abram set down the tin cup he had been holding, meeting her gaze without anger. "She's just a child," he said firmly, "and she's hungry. That's all I know, and that's all I care about." His voice carried the weight of conviction, the kind that brooked no argument. Mrs. Hensley's mouth tightened, and she left with a curt nod, murmuring something about stubborn men and foolish kindness. Other neighbors whispered in the streets, some stopping by to offer bits of food or clothing, others simply observing from a distance, unsure how to reconcile Abram's quiet authority with his unconventional decision. Children peeked from behind fences, curious and cautious, while adults muttered about the dangers of harboring someone who might bring shame, scandal, or worse. But Abram did not flinch. He had made his choice, and he would see it through. As the morning wore on, Miriam began to relax. She explored the barn cautiously, trailing her fingers along the wooden beams, the rough textures grounding her in a new reality. Abram watched her from across the room, noting every movement, every glance, every hesitant step. The barn, which had once been just a place to store hay and equipment, became a sanctuary, a fragile bubble of safety in a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty. For Abram, it was a reminder that kindness was rarely easy and courage often meant standing alone. But peace was fragile in Red Creek, and the town's judgment was never far. By midday, rumors had begun to swirl of traders returning, of neighbors considering formal complaints, and of lawmen who might see Abram's choice as a disruption of order. The weight of their scrutiny pressed against him, a constant reminder that morality often came with consequences. He felt it in the wary glances of passers-by, in the hushed conversations that stopped when he approached, in the faint tension in the air that suggested trouble might arrive sooner than expected. Still, Abram focused on Miriam, guiding her to a small corner of the barn where a bed of straw offered some comfort. He brought her water, speaking softly as he did so, explaining simple routines, how to fetch water from a well, how to tend to small chores, how to move quietly in the barn without startling the animals. Each task, mundane as it seemed, was a lesson in stability, a way to anchor her in the reality that she was not alone. And with each small success, her trust grew, just enough to make him believe that she could survive, if not thrive, in this harsh new life. By late afternoon, Abram allowed himself a moment to rest. He sat against the barn door, letting the sun warm his shoulders, eyes drifting toward the distant mountains where the horizon met sky. Miriam was nearby, tracing lines in the dust with her fingers, her face focused and intent, and for a fleeting moment, Abram imagined a future where she might find not just survival, but a sense of belonging. It was a fragile hope, easily shattered, yet it persisted, stubborn as the prairie grass clinging to the earth after a drought. Then came the sound that made his blood run cold, a distant hoofbeat, steady and deliberate, growing louder with each passing moment. Abram's gaze snapped to the open fields, eyes narrowing against the sun's glare. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the pull of danger that always seemed to follow acts of kindness in a world that preferred cruelty. Miriam looked up at him, sensing the shift in his posture, the tension coiling in his broad shoulders. She did not speak, only waited, trusting him implicitly even as uncertainty loomed. Abram's hand hovered near the edge of the barn door, ready for whatever might come, yet he did not panic. He had faced threats before, but this one was different. This one involved the life he had chosen to protect, a fragile spark of humanity in a world that had tried to snuff it out. The hoofbeats grew nearer, echoing across the plains, a drumbeat of inevitability. Abram tightened his grip on the door and Miriam clutched the blanket around her, eyes wide with fear and something else, anticipation, perhaps, or the faintest glimmer of hope that he would not fail her. In that tense, stretching moment, the barn seemed to shrink around them, the walls closing in with the weight of moral consequence. Abram inhaled slowly, listening to the rhythm of approaching hooves and the soft whisper of wind through the cracks in the wooden boards. He knew, as he always did, that the choices one made in silence often resonated louder than any shout. And he also knew that this day, like the ones before it, would demand courage, not in the way of gunfire or brawls, but in the quiet, steady commitment to protect the life that had been entrusted to him. The first shadow of a rider appeared on the horizon, dark against the golden plains. Abram squared his shoulders, lifting his chin, and allowed himself a small, private vow. No matter the cost, Miriam would not be sent back. The traders had no claim here. The town could whisper all it wanted, and the law could test his resolve if it dared. But for this girl, for the spark of life he had chosen to shield from cruelty, he would stand firm. And in that resolve, however fragile, the seeds of change began to take root, ready to grow in ways neither of them could yet imagine. Smoke curled from the horizon, thin and wavering, like the finger of a warning. Abram stood at the edge of his corral, eyes narrowing against the glare of midday sun. He could see riders in the distance, dust clouds rising in lazy spirals over the flat prairie. Not all of them were near enough to make out clearly, but their rhythm was unmistakable, deliberate, purposeful, and carrying the weight of intent. Abram's hand rested lightly on the rail, though his muscles were coiled beneath the surface, ready. He had made his choice to shelter Miriam, but choices like these rarely came without consequence. Miriam sat quietly on a bale of hay in the corner of the barn, her small hands busy untangling a frayed rope. Abram could feel her tension without a word. Children had a way of absorbing the atmosphere like a sponge. "Don't worry," he murmured, though his own voice betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. "Just stay here. No one's getting in without me knowing." She looked up at him, eyes wide, and nodded, swallowing down a tremor that threatened to betray her courage. The barn, once a place of refuge, now felt like a fragile bubble pressed between the weight of the outside world and the uncertainty of what was approaching. The first visitor arrived not with gunfire or anger, but with words and suspicion. Sheriff Colby, a thin, hawk-faced man, rode slowly up to the gate, reins held loosely in one hand. "Abram," he called, voice measured, carrying across the yard. "I hear you've taken in that girl the traders had. Town's talking. Folks are concerned. You might be asking for trouble." Abram did not flinch. "I'm aware of the chatter," he said evenly. "She needed help. That's all." The sheriff's eyes, sharp and assessing, flicked toward the barn, noting the form of Miriam beneath the shadows of straw. "It's not just chatter," he said. "It's law. The traders could make a claim, or worse. You're walking a fine line." Abram let silence answer, his jaw tight. The law might be written, but morality often required bending the edges of what was considered acceptable. Rumors spread faster than wildfire in Red Creek. By mid-morning, a small crowd of neighbors gathered near the fence line. Some came with bread or scraps of food, murmuring encouragement. Others whispered warnings, their voices thick with judgment. "He's crazy," one woman hissed, clutching her shawl tighter. "Bringing her in like this, everyone's going to know. It won't end well." Abram met their stares evenly, offering no explanation beyond what was necessary. "She's a child," he repeated softly. "Hunger and fear aren't crimes." His words were simple, but in the barren honesty of the barn, they carried weight. Miriam's movements became more confident as the morning wore on, yet each sound from outside, a hoofbeat, a shouted word, the clatter of wagon wheels, drew her back to caution. Abram remained near, always between her and the door, observing, guiding, protecting. He taught her small tasks, filling the water pail, sweeping the floor, stacking firewood. Each instruction carried more than utility. It offered rhythm and stability, something she had been starved of in a world that had treated her as disposable. By afternoon, the tension began to crystallize into tangible pressure. The traders had sent a messenger to town, demanding restitution or the girl's return. Some neighbors, driven by fear of conflict or retribution, began to suggest that Abram yield. "You're brave, Abram," one elderly man said, "but bravery doesn't always keep you alive." Abram's expression was unreadable, a mask honed by years of solitary living. "Some things," he said quietly, "are worth the risk. She is one of them." The man shook his head, unable to argue with the firmness in Abram's stance. As the day deepened, the distant riders drew closer, and Abram's sense of isolation grew. Each hoofbeat sounded like a countdown. He could see a few figures atop a hill, dust kicking up around their horses. Their intent was unclear, though their posture spoke of purpose and authority. Abram's mind raced. These could be traders seeking recovery, hired men sent to enforce a claim, or even townsfolk with grudges masked as law. But he knew one thing: he could not turn away. Miriam's small hand, resting on a bundle of hay, reminded him why the world often demanded courage in the face of uncertainty. Inside the barn, he kept Miriam close, speaking softly to calm her nerves. "If anyone comes, don't be afraid," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "I'll handle it." She nodded, eyes wide but trust growing. There was no pride in his reassurance, only a quiet promise he intended to keep. The moral decision he had made, to shelter her against the judgment of all others, was now testing him. Each approach from the outside world was a reminder that kindness often invited scrutiny, suspicion, and even danger. Even as the sun began its descent toward the western hills, Abram could feel the pressure mounting. The riders' shadows stretched long across the prairie, and murmurs from the town carried faintly in the wind. Neighbors had begun to gather, some curious, some fearful, others openly hostile. Abram's choice, simple in its intent, had created ripples that threatened to wash away the fragile calm of the ranch. He clenched his fists, then released them, letting the movement anchor him. There would be words, maybe threats, maybe confrontation, but Abram had made his decision. Miriam would not be sent back. As dusk approached, a figure appeared at the edge of the yard, silhouetted against the fading light. Abram recognized the stance immediately, a rider, scanning the horizon, measuring the land, and the man who dared to defy expectation. The sheriff, the traders, or someone else entirely. It didn't matter. The moral choice he had made demanded he stand firm, regardless of consequence. He took a deep breath, feeling the tension coil in his chest like a spring ready to release. Miriam shifted beside him, and he placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Stay behind me," he said softly. "Whatever comes, I've got you." Night would fall soon, and with it, the unknown would arrive. Abram could hear it in the wind, in the quiet rustle of straw, in the distant cries of animals settling down for the evening. The moral decision, the act of choosing compassion over convenience, had set forces in motion that could not be easily stopped. And yet, as the shadows lengthened and the first stars appeared above the western horizon, Abram felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. He would not waver. Miriam's life, fragile and newly entrusted to him, was worth every risk, every whisper of danger, every judgment cast by the world outside the barn walls. The first sound of a horse's hoof on the path drew his eyes to the horizon. Dust rose in lazy swirls, shadows stretching over the fields, and Abram knew the reckoning of his choice was nearly upon him. But he did not move to flee. He stood his ground, steady as the land beneath his boots, ready to face whatever would come. Miriam, small and uncertain, clung to the hope he had given her. And in that moment, amidst rising tension, the vast and silent prairie held its breath alongside them, waiting to see what courage truly meant. The distant rumble of hoofbeats had grown into a steady, unmistakable rhythm. Abram squinted against the heat haze shimmering above the prairie, watching as a small contingent of riders appeared over the rise. Dust kicked up around their horses, painting the late afternoon in muted gold and brown. Their approach was neither hurried nor chaotic, each movement deliberate, calculated, heavy with the weight of intent. Abram's stomach tightened. He had expected consequences, but not so tangible, not so immediate. He moved closer to the barn, fingers brushing along the worn wooden beams as he checked the latches and doors. Miriam's presence weighed on him, though not as a burden. She moved quietly in the corner, folding straw into a small cushion, eyes flicking toward him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "They're coming," Abram murmured, more to himself than to her. She didn't speak, only nodded, trusting him to navigate the peril that neither of them could yet see fully. The riders were a mix of lawmen and town emissaries, though their intent was unclear. A tall man on the lead horse raised a hand in greeting, but the gesture carried no warmth, only cautious acknowledgement. "Abram," the rider called, voice steady but edged with authority. "We need a word. Town council says this girl has a claim elsewhere." Abram's eyes narrowed. "I know her situation," he replied. "She's safe here. That's all you need to know." The rider's jaw tightened, a flicker of frustration passing across his sharp features. "You don't understand," he said. "The traders have connections, the law is involved, and folks are anxious. This isn't just about her, it's about order." Abram's reply was calm, his tone measured but firm. "Order doesn't make right." From behind the barn, the murmurs of neighbors began to rise. Some were leaning over fences, faces drawn and pale, hands wringing handkerchiefs or gripping fence posts. "You're asking for trouble," one whispered to another. "He can't protect her forever." Others offered more hesitant support, bringing water jugs or scraps of bread, eyes darting toward Abram as if to gauge whether he would falter. The pressure of public scrutiny pressed against the barn walls, yet Abram remained still, a steady anchor in a sea of judgment and fear. Inside, Miriam's small hands fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve. She had grown more confident in the past days, yet each sound from outside, the creak of leather, the low murmur of voices, the occasional distant shout, made her pause, reminded her of the dangers she had escaped and those that still lingered. Abram crouched beside her, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. "Stay close," he whispered. "Don't let fear make you small. Just follow me." She nodded, swallowing the tremor in her throat. The riders dismounted slowly, dust settling around their boots as they approached the barn. One of them, a burly man with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward. "We don't want trouble, Abram," he said, tone even but firm. "We just need her returned. Traders, town council, they're all pressing. This can end peacefully, or it can end badly." Abram studied the man's eyes, reading beyond the words. Beneath the polite veneer was expectation, perhaps even the threat of force if compliance was not forthcoming. He shifted slightly, hands resting lightly on the beams of the barn, grounding himself. "She's not returning," he said quietly. "Not to them, not to anyone who would treat her like a thing to trade. She has a life here, and I intend to protect it." A tense silence settled, broken only by the wind whispering through the barn cracks and the distant cries of cattle. Miriam, watching from her corner, felt the weight of the confrontation pressing against her small frame. Abram glanced toward her, catching the slight tremor in her shoulders. He gave a subtle nod, a silent reassurance that he would not let them take her, that he would face whatever came without faltering. The scarred man exchanged a glance with the tall rider. "You're walking a dangerous line," he said. "This isn't just about compassion. People have expectations. Laws exist for a reason." Abram's jaw tightened. "And compassion exists for a reason too," he replied evenly. "Sometimes the law isn't enough to protect the innocent." The conversation hung in the air, thick and unyielding. Dust motes drifted lazily in the fading light, catching in Miriam's dark hair as she watched. She felt something shift within her, a fragile understanding that the man who had sheltered her was more than just a protector. He was a moral anchor willing to risk everything for the sake of what was right. Suddenly, a distant scream carried across the prairie. It was raw, urgent, and full of fear. All eyes turned toward the sound, and Abram's hand instinctively moved toward his coat pocket, resting near the revolver he had carried for decades but rarely drawn. The riders tensed, murmuring warnings, and Miriam clutched the blanket closer, eyes wide. The prairie, which had seemed vast and empty just moments before, now felt crowded with unseen threats, moral dilemmas, and the creeping tension of imminent danger. Abram's mind raced, balancing the precarious scales of morality and consequence. Every decision he made from this point would ripple outward, affecting not just Miriam and himself, but the entire town of Red Creek. The moral choice to protect her had already set events into motion, and now the world was pressing in, demanding either courage or surrender. He inhaled slowly, feeling the sun warm his back and the earth firm beneath his boots. He turned slightly toward Miriam, offering a faint, steady smile. "Whatever happens," he said softly, "we face it together. I won't let them take you." She met his gaze, a spark of trust and hope flaring in her wide eyes, and nodded. The riders remained tense outside, the town's murmurs growing faintly louder with unease. Abram could hear it in the way the horses shifted, the quiet scrape of boots on wood, the soft, apprehensive breaths of neighbors peeking from behind fences. Night would soon fall, bringing with it shadows that could hide both danger and salvation. Abram tightened his stance, ready to meet whatever challenge the approaching riders and the consequences of his moral choice would bring. For Miriam, for the fragile hope of safety and dignity, he would stand unwavering. And in the quiet, golden light of the late afternoon, the tension was palpable, stretching the prairie taut like a bowstring ready to release. He knew, with every fiber of his being, that once the threat arrived, there would be no turning back. Choices made in the calm of principle now demanded action in the heat of reality. And Abram, steady as the earth beneath him, prepared to defend not just a child, but the very notion that kindness could endure in a world intent on eroding it. The first horn of evening drifted across the prairie, low and mournful, carrying a weight that made Abram's chest tighten. Dust rose from the hoofbeats of the approaching riders, now closer and more distinct, forming a dark, deliberate line against the golden horizon. This was no casual inspection or polite warning. Each movement of the horses spoke of intent and authority, of people who had been sent to enforce a claim and deliver judgment. Abram felt the familiar coil of tension tighten in his gut. Danger had arrived, and it carried the quiet inevitability of a storm. He moved to the barn's doorway, casting a long shadow across the dry earth. Miriam, standing behind him, clutched the blanket around her shoulders, eyes wide with both fear and trust. "It's all right," Abram said quietly, though his own voice was steadier than he felt. "Just stay close. Don't make a sound." The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that makes every scrape of leather or whisper of wind feel amplified, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The riders slowed as they approached the fence, dust curling around their horses' legs. The leader, a tall man with a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat, raised a hand, a signal of negotiation rather than confrontation, but the weight of authority pressed down with undeniable force. "Abram," he called, voice carrying clearly, "we don't want trouble. But the girl, she belongs elsewhere. Return her, and there will be no need for force." Abram squared his shoulders, feeling the familiar heat of responsibility settle into him. She's not returning. Not to anyone who would see her as merchandise. His tone left no room for argument, and for a moment, silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Inside the barn, Miriam's fingers tightened around the blanket, knuckles pale. She had been sheltered, fed, and tended to over the past days, but now the threat of removal felt immediate, tangible. Abram noticed her hesitation and offered a reassuring hand on her shoulder, steadying her without a word. The barn, once a sanctuary, now felt like a fragile bubble pressed against a world brimming with judgment, authority, and potential violence. The riders exchanged glances, measuring him, measuring the girl, and calculating the consequences of a direct confrontation. The tall man dismounted slowly, boots crunching against the dry earth. "This doesn't have to get ugly," he said, taking a careful step closer. "You can give her back. The traders want their property, and the law expects compliance." Abram met his eyes evenly. "She is not property. She is a child. You may take what you will from others, but I will not participate in cruelty disguised as order." A murmur rose from the onlookers, neighbors who had gathered at a safe distance. Some shifted uneasily, while others whispered approval or sympathy. The barn's quiet interior felt alive with tension, every heartbeat amplified, every breath deliberate. Miriam's gaze flicked to Abram, silently questioning, and he responded with a faint nod, a promise that whatever came, he would not falter. The scarred man at the rear of the group stepped forward, voice sharper this time. "You think your kindness shields you? Laws are not optional. Town council has been clear, and the traders are persistent. Do not mistake your moral high ground for safety." Abram's reply was calm, but resolute. "Safety isn't the point. Protection is. And I intend to protect her, even if the world disapproves." His words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched across the fields, merging with the dust stirred by the horses. Abram could hear the distant clang of tools and the shuffle of straw under Miriam's feet, small sounds that anchored him to the present and reminded him why he had chosen to intervene. Outside, the tension mounted, the riders' patience thin, yet their strategy deliberate. They could see the resolve in Abram's posture, the quiet authority in his stillness, and they weighed their next move carefully. A faint whistle carried across the barn, a subtle signal from one of the riders, and Abram's pulse quickened. He knew that while talk could delay action, it could not prevent it indefinitely. The moral decision he had made, to shelter Miriam against warnings, law, and societal expectation, had now attracted the weight of consequence. Every option offered risk, every hesitation carried potential for harm. Yet retreat was unthinkable. Abram glanced down at Miriam, who had crouched slightly, eyes wide but unflinching in her silent trust. He allowed himself a single, steadying breath, letting the evening air fill his lungs. The vast prairie beyond the barn seemed to hold its own suspense, the open sky stretching endless and indifferent above them. Yet within this bubble of dust and wood, of morality and consequence, Abram understood that courage would not be measured by the absence of fear, but by the choice to act despite it. The riders began to form a slow circle around the barn, positioning themselves carefully, neither rushed nor careless. Abram noted each movement, each subtle shift in weight or gaze, the quiet tension coiling like a spring ready to release. The moment demanded precision, patience, and the moral clarity that had brought Miriam here in the first place. He placed a firm hand on the barn door, fingers brushing the grained wood, ready to meet force with calm and vigilance. Miriam's small voice broke the silence, barely a whisper. "What do they want?" Abram's eyes met hers, and he shook his head slightly. "They want to take what they believe is theirs. But we will not let them. Stay close. Listen, watch, and trust. That is all you need." Her lips pressed together, eyes wide and attentive, and for a fleeting moment, Abram felt a fragile pride, not in himself, but in the quiet courage that had blossomed in her, nurtured by days of shelter and care. As the last light of sun gilded the horizon, the riders paused, the air thick with anticipation. Abram's stance remained unwavering, hands relaxed but ready, eyes steady on the approaching threat. The prairie seemed to hold its breath, dust suspended in the fading light, and Miriam clung to him, not in fear, but in trust. The quiet standoff stretched, each second laden with possibility, confrontation, negotiation, perhaps even disaster. Abram inhaled slowly, feeling the heat of the day drain from his body, replaced by a cool resolve. Danger had arrived, and it would not relent. But neither would he. Whatever the world demanded, whatever the riders carried, he would protect the girl who had become the center of his moral compass. The evening air was alive with tension, each rustle of wind or distant cry of a bird echoing the stakes of the moment. And as darkness crept across the fields, Abram understood with absolute certainty that the choices made here, in the quiet between words and beneath the shadow of approaching riders, would shape everything to come.